Hi, my name is Adrian Reed, and I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Cynthia Davis, who is Chief Executive and Founder of Bain Recruitment. Now, Cynthia will be speaking at the IRM BCT, that's the Business Change and Transformation Conference, later this month, on a panel entitled Diversity and Inclusion, Essential for Good Business and Society. And Cynthia kindly agreed to spend some time with me talking about that topic today. So Cynthia, welcome, and thanks for making the time to have a chat. I know how busy you've been today.
Thanks, Adrian. Yes, it's been one of those days, I'm afraid, but yeah, always busy, busy, busy.
Always a good thing, always a good thing. So Cynthia, the panel topic, it strikes me as a really significant one. And we quite rightly hear a lot about diversity and inclusion in business today, but I do sense sometimes that terminology can cause a bit of confusion. So how would you define diversity and inclusion, and what would you say the difference between those two important concepts are, and I guess why are they so good for business as well?
Brilliant. Okay, well, great question, Adrian. And I think for me, I always try and simplify it, because I think when you try and get it all kind of too technical, people get a little bit confused. So I always have this analogy where I think diversity is being invited to a party, and inclusion is being asked to dance.
I love it.
And I go one further and go, equality is actually being part of the party planning committee.
Fantastic. That's a beautiful analogy, and actually it's interesting, isn't it, because the equality being part of the committee, actually having a place at the table to set the agenda, is so very, very important, and something that often, it's interesting that it's not, you know, the mantra tends to be diversity and inclusion, but actually equality is probably equally, if not more important. So
I couldn't agree more. And I think for me, it's about making sure that everyone has equity and feels that they have equity. And I think that's when true belonging, really starts to come through. And I think that's pretty much when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's really the ultimate goal is to make sure that people feel included and that they have equity in whatever that process is. And equality is so key to that.
And you mentioned that sense of belonging, and so pivoting to talk a little bit about why these topics are so good for business. I mean, I guess it's easy to extrapolate and say, well, if people feel a sense of belonging, they probably perform better, I would guess, in their role. They bring, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but they bring their whole selves to work. They don't feel they have to hide part of their identity or who they are. But do you think there's a sense in which if you've got a diverse set of voices in the room, that actually decision making is better?
Yeah, certainly. And the way I look at it is, if you have everyone around the table that thinks the same, is probably from the same kind of background, you probably got too many people around the table, right? So, diversity isn't just around things like ethnicity or gender. It's also different thought perspectives. You get different kind of results. People's different experiences or lived experience will also give you that innovation, because they've lived through things differently and therefore can think differently and give you a different outlook on whatever the decision is that you're having. So
yeah, that difference in lived experience, different in worldview, and that sort of linking that to innovation is really interesting, isn't it? Because oftentimes you do get people with very similar backgrounds who tend to move in a very linear way. So maybe there's something about that lateral thinking as well, sort of getting those more innovative ideas. So fantastic. So thinking about building diversity and inclusion and equality and belonging into what we do as practitioners, and what the people at the conference, I'm sure, will do as practitioners. I suspect many organisations have, for example, employment processes, and they have procedures and they have checklists which are intended to ensure that diversity and inclusion aren't forgotten, and those things are important, and there's legislation for a reason, and that's a very positive thing, of course. But that to me feels a very different thing from building it into the fabric of the organisation.
You're right, and I think for me, and I always say, D&I is a journey, right? And you've got to start somewhere, and it's how do you start embedding the right kind of processes and procedures that in 5-10 years time, that becomes your DNA. So it's not an afterthought. It's not something that you're almost having to constantly be referring back to a book or a handbook or anything like that. It's now part of your organization. You're living and breathing it because you've set up, the right kind of processes and the right kind of culture to foster that kind of environment that is inclusive to everybody. So, you have to start somewhere. You have to look at, what kind of an environment do we have? Does it allow people to come in and succeed and thrive? And if not, what do we need to do to make sure that that happens? And then moving forward, anyone that comes into your organization, they're joining an environment that's already on that journey of being inclusive, and you continuously improving that. And I don't think there's ever a destination that you can say, well, we've achieved it, now we're going to rest on our laurels. You have to constantly be evolving, constantly making sure that people feel valued, and giving people that voice, that, and creating safe spaces that when, people don't feel that, it is the right kind of culture, they're able to say that, and able to come forward and, talk about things like that. So that employee engagement then becomes really, really important as well. So for us, it's about making that part of your DNA and part of your fabric of your organization. And then it just becomes part of the continual journey of your business.
Interesting, Cynthia. And one thing I really liked or really resonated with what you said there, for me at least, is that idea that actually it's ongoing. Like it's not about a destination. It's not about becoming a level 5, diversity. And I mean, that might be part of it. That might be an aim. But actually there's a sort of bigger outcome at stake here. And if I understood you correctly, it seems like there's a strong sense of needing to get regular feedback from the people. So actually you've got to build in that dialogue that, well, actually, is this working? Is it okay? To ensure that it really is working.
It is, and I'm very much about process and evaluating that, and measuring that. So, if you put in place kind of matrix that you need to achieve, without really going back and looking and say, are you achieving that? And if not, why not? What do you need to do to improve that? And data is so important. One of the things I always say to a lot of the organizations that we work with, without understanding what your data is saying about your workforce, it's difficult for you to try and change that. So it's, when we talk about things like the gender pay gap, the reason that we're now talking about it is because people had to start divulging that data, and then all of a sudden they realize, okay, it's not as equal or as we thought it was, and therefore it allowed organizations to almost reevaluate the way that they compensate and remunerate the roles within organizations. But it's really using that information to then be able to put in place the right kind of processes that allow for that equality that we were talking about earlier to come through.
Yeah, making things visible, like making things which are inequitable visible, tends to I guess change people's attitudes and behaviours in a way, doesn't it? So
exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked largely about these topics internally so far, about ensuring people are comfortable and feel a sense of belonging and so on. But of course, there's also the fact that many people, I'm sure, who go to the conference will be involved with designing services that are exposed to the outside world. And of course, we need to make sure the services or products we design work for everyone. Well, particularly if you're a government, for everyone, right? And there can be a sort of, there can be a tendency to create personas and an average user, and of course the average user never exists. So, I mean, any tips on how we can ensure that the services we offer actually work for real people in the outside world?
It's really by making sure that, you are including real people that will access those services. So, one of the things I would say is we're so lucky to live in one of the most diverse cities in the world where everyone's represented. And I don't know a business that's only got one type of customer base. So, your customer base is very diverse, and therefore, without really understanding, the wider demographic of your customer base, it's hard to have the right kind of products and services that appeal to that demographic of people, and that's all your customer base, not just a certain segment of it. And that's been proven time after time. We've seen it in when marketing campaigns go wrong, where organizations have run campaigns and then there's been a massive backlash because they've not you know, the tone was maybe of a negative connotation to certain demographic of people, because the insight, or there was nobody around that table that could have looked at that insight and said, actually, how would this be perceived by this group of people if we run a campaign that's like this? So it's really, really important when you are putting products and services is to understand the full demographic of your customer base, but you can't do that if you don't have that representation involved in that process. Hence why we talk about diversity being, you know, imperative for any business, is you do need to be as representative as your customer base is.
That's really interesting, because perhaps extrapolating a little bit from what you're suggesting there, Cynthia, but actually, if there's good diversity internally, then actually there's a chance that if someone came up with something that was not on message, or might be, you know, interpreted negatively, someone would spot it internally. whereas if you've got a sort of monoculture of a particular segment of people internally, it would be a blind side. So
exactly, and I think AI an interesting one recently, because, you know, there's been so much kind of talk about how AI has got a lot of things wrong because it's been tested on only one demographic of people, and therefore it's not, you know, user friendly for everybody. And, you know, so when you think of it from an external point of view, the people that then end users of that product, because they've not been represented, you know, the product then sometimes doesn't work. And it's that investment that you've had in terms of taking a product to market, and it only works for a small percentage of people and not everybody. So
yeah, an expensive mistake, and
a
very ethically questionable mistake, I think, as well. Fantastic. So imagine that there was an individual in an organization that was starting its diversity and inclusion journey, and they're not necessarily a senior manager or an executive. What proactive, positive steps could that individual take to maybe just a subtle nudge of the culture in a positive direction?
You know, I think there's a lot of, you know, empowerment that I feel, you know, people can take upon themselves. So as staff or as employees, you know, it shouldn't just be D&I, shouldn't just be a HR problem or resourcing kind of problem. This is about all of us. You know, it's about creating the right environment that all of us want to be in. So therefore, it's sometimes about taking that onus on ourselves to say, right, something's not right. You should feel comfortable enough to either call it out or find a solution to say, well, here's how I think we could do this better. We find a lot of organizations that have employee resource groups, you know, tend to feed a lot, you know, from those resource groups, whether that's a gender network or a multicultural kind of network or an LGBT plus kind of network. You know, you can create these kind of networks, and they don't cost anything as employees to come together to think, well, how can we support certain kind of communities, or how can we come together as a staff network to make sure that collectively, you know, we can have a voice that is able to really affect change in a meaningful and impactful and positive way. And I think there's strength in numbers, and it's about, you know, getting other people together, or being the first one to stand up and say, right, I'm going to create a forum where people can come and talk about in a safe environment where we can talk about maybe some of the issues or challenges that we're feeling, you know, but create a safe space where people feel comfortable to do that. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be anything formal as such, but it's just making sure that, you know, your staff feel empowered, that they can also have a voice, that it shouldn't be something that they wait for somebody else to fix, that they too can, you know, take that upon themselves and do something to achieve that change.
Fantastic. So there's an old phrase that you've probably heard, Cynthia, that was resonating as I was hearing you speak there, which is, to a certain extent, ask for forgiveness, not for permission.
Yes.
Just set up a forum or network, and you know what? No one's going to sack you for it. And if they do sack you for it, you're in the wrong place, and you've probably got an unfair dismissal claim. So, you know.
but exactly, and I'm a great believer. But be the change that you want to see. You know, it shouldn't be about waiting for somebody else to go fix the world for you or fix your environment for you. You know, if something needs changing, then maybe it's be the one that stands up and changes it. You know, and by that you'll start a ripple effect that others feel empowered to follow suit, and, you know, and do the same, and then collectively you then create a movement.
Absolutely, fantastic. Well, Cynthia, a final question for you.
Oh,
So
Make it a good one.
So the BCT conference, Business Change and Transformation, I mean, it attracts people from all sorts of different disciplines, from all sorts of different countries. I mean, I'm a business analyst, as it happens, and the reason I like the conference, or one of the reasons I like it, is it's interdisciplinary. So I get to meet all sorts of cool people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and we, we learn from each other. So I love that interdisciplinary nature. But from your perspective, what is it that attracts you to the conference? Or I guess put differently, why should people attend it from your perspective? Other than to see you, of course.
It's actually my first year of attending the conference, so I'm very excited to be meeting, a wide array of organisations that, it's about sharing best practice, understanding what's happening in other organisations' worlds, in other environments, in other companies that, is affecting positive change in our society. So for me, it's a bit of networking, a bit of finding out about what other companies are doing that can also be useful for us as an organization, and just meeting some new people. I'm looking forward to hearing some speakers as well. There's some incredible speakers that will be in attendance that I've got my eye on to try and make sure I hear them speak, who are thought leaders, and will be talking around fantastic subjects that I know, as an entrepreneur and a business person, are very beneficial for us as a business. So therefore I will be making sure I'm there, and I'll be attending. So I would urge everybody to, if they are available over those 3 days, to pop by and come say hello. I'll be there on the 18th, so hopefully I get to meet you. And if you've got any questions around D&I and how you can embed this within your own organization, feel free to come up and say hello.
Fantastic, Cynthia. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. That's been a whistle-stop tour. I think we could talk for hours on this topic, and I'm sure people viewing this will want to know more and hear more. So if you are watching this, there'll be a link to the registration page in the comments in the video comments below. So do take a look, do register, and Cynthia, thanks once again, and see you at the conference.
See you at the conference, Adrian. Hope to see everybody at the conference too.
Bye.